President Trump is threatening to conduct nationwide immigration raids, and lawmakers are scrambling to respond. The president gave Democrats 2 weeks to come up with changes to asylum laws to cut down on illegal immigration. Our Ed O'Keefe sat down with 2020 presidential candidate Kamala Harris, who had something to say to immigrants.
My message to them is that you are not alone, and we stand with you, and there are those of us who will fight for you and your rights every day. My message to them is, do not live in fear. You are not alone, and America's values are such that we do not condone, as an American value, putting children in cages. America's values are not that we separate families and take children from their parents. And I would tell them that a new day is coming. We got to get beyond this election, but that we as a nation are better than this. Because I'm going to tell you, the reason I say all that is that I know how this is going to play out. And I know what's been happening since the beginning when this president was elected, which is these immigrant families have been further pushed into to living underground, to living in the shadows. That's not reflective of the civil society.
If ICE comes looking for them, should they hide? Should they stay in the shadows?
Listen, I'll tell you what they're going to do. I'll tell you what they're going to do because it's already happened. Children will not want to go to school out of fear that if they go to school, they will come home and their parents won't be there because they will have been picked up and deported. There will be children, and parents will not send those children to the pediatrician for fear that if they walk into a hospital, they will be deported. What will happen is a victim of rape or child molestation or fraud will not wave down a police officer in the middle of the street for fear that if they have that contact, they will be deported. These are the things that will happen. These are the things that will happen.
Those thousands in detention facilities along the border, if they're still there, you take office. What happens to them?
Well, first of all, it's about understanding why they are there. And the majority of them are there because they have fled murder capitals of the world. And I think it's very important that when we think about this issue, we understand it in the context of real people and what they are experiencing.
So how do you treat them once they're here?
What you do is you give them the benefit of a process that we put in place a very long time ago, anticipating that there will be people around the globe who will flee harm, who will flee danger and arrive at our shores. And we put in place a process because we said, as Americans, we have strong arms that will embrace those who are being hurt. So we put in place a process to hear their stories, to determine the legitimacy of their stories, and if their story is legitimate, to give them a place of refuge and safety. And as President of the United States, I will make sure that is a real process so that we can hear their claims, and if they are deserving of protection, we will give it to them.
But they wouldn't be released from those detention facilities the moment you take office?
Well, no, listen, there has to be a process in place, but let's be clear. I mean, we can get into the details of this. Part of what we had under the previous administration, which worked actually better than what's happening now, is we had a process where people would be released from custody with an order to return, but they would go to these family centers, and actually it had a 90-something% rate of return. So let's again figure out what the goal is. Is the goal to put people in cages, or is the goal to make sure that we have a process by which we make sure that those who deserve safety and refuge, that they receive it, and those who don't, if there are any who are trying to game the system, then they don't receive it.
Ed O'Keefe there. His voice just a little scratchy. He's a real trooper working through things. Obviously, he's a little bit under the weather. But now, CBS News reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez is in Washington joining us to talk a little bit more about this. So, Camilo, you've been following this story. What could this delay mean for undocumented immigrants? I imagine it's particularly stressful not knowing from one day to the next whether or not there will be an uptick in raids. But what's it going to mean to these people?
Right, so it seems to have been a temporary reprieve. Remember that ICE conducts removal operations weekly. You know, they do this on a weekly basis. But what seems to have been postponed was this highly publicized roundup of families who had pending removal orders. So they went through the court system. Some of them missed their court hearing for whatever reason. They didn't have the correct address on file, or they didn't have access to legal representation, and they did not appear at the court hearing, and so the judge order them to be removed from the country. That was the operation that was going to be targeted at these families. That seems to have been postponed by the president until, like he said, Congress overhauls the asylum process. So it is a temporary reprieve, because remember, I had been talking to some immigrant advocates over the weekend who had been mounting this really unprecedented campaign of awareness to prepare undocumented migrants for this what seemed to be an eventuality, right? These mass roundups. So it seems to have been a temporary reprieve for them.
Meanwhile, there's a bit of finger-pointing going on. Vice President Mike Pence addressed the controversy on Face the Nation yesterday. This is what he had to say.
So the president is doing his job. We both took an oath to faithfully execute the laws of this country. He set into motion an internal enforcement effort to remove people who've been given due process of law, who've been adjudicated through a court order, ordered to be deported. But the president, talking with Speaker Pelosi and other Democrats, made the decision to delay 2 weeks and to call on the Congress once again to close the loopholes that human traffickers are using.
Is that going to happen in 2 weeks?
Families.
You expect Congress to pass that in 2 weeks?
Honestly, the president, I believe it could happen in 15 minutes. If Democrats in Congress will simply step up and agree to close the loopholes that we know human traffickers are using to exploit vulnerable families.
So, you know, there you have Mike Pence sort of explaining why the president backtracked a little bit. I don't know if it's an indication of some flexibility on the administration's part or a flip-flopping, however you want to see it. But, you know, what does this mean for the administration's stance on immigration?
Right. So, you know, the administration to deal with this unprecedented surge of Central American families heading towards the southwest border, the administration has really taken a twofold approach. At the border, they've implemented the Remain in Mexico policy of having asylum seekers wait in Mexico when they claim asylum at U.S. ports of entries, and they're expanding this one. But at the interior, they wanted to do these roundups to send a message to families in Central America that even if they come to the country, seek asylum, and go through the court process, they are very likely to be deported as well. So these are all tactics of deterrence, but obviously the president is postponing that in the hope that Congress can broker a deal to overhaul asylum, which is very unlikely. These laws have been in the books for decades, some of them even longer than that. What the president also must have taken into account is that Congress is currently negotiating his request for a multi-billion-dollar package to fund the Department of Health and Human Services, Customs and Border Protection, which oversees the Border Patrol, even ICE, to deal with this surge in migrants. So he knew that the Democratic-controlled House needed to sign off on this package. So I'm guessing he must have taken that into account, especially after Speaker Nancy Pelosi called him and urged him to back off.
Right. So you just mentioned these laws have been on the books for many years. Margaret Brennan asked whether or not 2 weeks are really enough. The vice president seems to think that the laws could be changed in 15 minutes. Somehow I doubt that. But what options are available to Congress?
Right. Like I said, it's very unlikely that there is any overhaul in the asylum system here in the U.S. In the near future. Remember, so what the president and Republicans in the administration see as loopholes, migrants not being able to be deported immediately, children have special protections, families can be detained for more than 20 days. Migrants from countries that do not border the U.S. cannot be immediately deported to their home countries, especially if they face persecution. These so-called loopholes that the administration often rails against, Democrats see them and immigrant advocates see them as special protections for vulnerable populations. So there is some disagreement in the terminology there. So that's pretty much going to be a main sticking point in negotiations as well.
And so what happens next? If the laws aren't changed in 2 weeks, then does that mean these raids kick into gear?
It is unclear. I mean, I think the president is determined to carry out these raids, not really for the technicality of it, but like I said, just to send a message, you know, like some immigrant advocates that I called over the weekend said, you know, the message of the president was very clear. You know, many immigrant families, especially those who are undocumented or those who have mixed status, they're part of a mixed status household, were very fearful. You know, they were calling these groups for advice, for help, asking them what they should do. So the message was sent pretty clear, and I'm guessing people in Central America also were able to see that in newspapers and television. So the message was sent, but it is unclear if he's actually going to carry this out, because obviously it would alienate Democrats and even some independents, especially if he wants to continue pushing his immigration agenda.
Yeah. Camilo, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ann.